All right, we are in the final lecture of cryptography, at least for CS161. I feel like I reversed the orders of those words, but it's fine. Basically, this is the last crypto lecture. So if you were really excited about crypto, we can get a collective sigh from the audience. If you really hated crypto and are ready for something having to do with web browsers, then we can get a collective woo from the audience. But again, I am incapable of wooing, so I'll just bypass that myself. I'm excited for both units. I think they're all really interesting. But yeah, last time we talked about public key encryption and digital signatures. So these are both asymmetric cryptography or public key cryptography, where we have two keys. One thing does one thing and one thing does the other thing that the first key does not do. For encryption, one key encrypts and the other decrypts. We talked about LGMAL and RSA, which are two public key encryption algorithms that sort of achieve the same thing. LGMAL is based on Diffie-Hellman, and RSA is based on E and D that are mathematically related, such that if we raise m to the power of E to the power of D, we get back the original m, at least if we take m mod n. We also talked about hybrid encryption. So we know that asymmetric encryption is slow and it uses mod math and number theory. So what we actually do is we just encrypt a symmetric key and use the symmetric key to encrypt things in turn. So that's how it's done most efficiently, and that's how you probably should do it if you ever implement this yourself. And finally, we talked about digital signatures. So we talked about public key encryption. Digital signatures are basically the public key max. They provide integrity and authenticity. And the algorithm there was RSA, which is the same as RSA encryption, except you're encrypting with the private key rather than the public key. Today, we talked about the problem of how do we actually get public keys to one another. If I send my public key to Perrin, Mallory can just sit in the middle and instead send her public key to Perrin instead of mine. And then suddenly Mallory is still a man in the middle. And then we're going to talk about passwords a little bit, just because we're at the end of this unit. We have a couple of random topics that we need to get through just to flesh out our application of crypto and start to talk about how it's applied in the real world. All right, certificates. So public key crypto is great because we don't need to share a secret key. We don't need to do a Diffie-Hellman. No, if I want to send a message to Bob, Bob doesn't have to be online. Yeah, with both of these, everyone can verify a signature with a public key, and anyone can encrypt to the public key without the owner being online. But the catch is that we don't know what Bob's public key is. We have no way of knowing if we receive a public key that that key is actually Bob's. So we talked about man-in-the-middle attacks. Let's say that Alice wants to send a message to Bob. Alice is going to ask Bob for his public key because, I need it to encrypt things. Bob sends his public key to Alice, but now Alice is going to encrypt her message with Bob's public key, and Alice is going to send that message to Bob. This sounds great, but it sounds too easy. And as we talked about earlier, Mallory can easily intercept this. Mallory can just sit in the middle, replace Bob's public key that he sent with Mallory's public key, and now Alice is encrypting using Mallory's public key instead of Bob's. So that looks, interesting. I think we duplicated this slide. Oops. This is a diagram of what that looks like. So we have Bob generating his public key and private key here. He's sending the public key, but Mallory's intercepting that. So this is blocked off. Mallory instead sends her public key, which Alice receives. She doesn't know that this is Mallory's public key because she just received, a number, basically. So she's going to encrypt her message with Mallory's public key. Mallory can sit in the middle, decrypt it, say, oh, that's really nice message you've got there, Alice, and then re-encrypt it with Bob's public key and forward it along. So now Bob is decrypting with his public key, and neither Alice nor Bob know that someone's sitting in the middle. So how do we fix this? Here's an idea. What if we sign Bob's public key? So this way, no one can generate a signature using Bob's private key. So a signature on Bob's public key should verify that this public key actually belongs to Bob. What's the problem with this? I guess, spoiler alert, there's a problem with this. What's the problem? All right, I'll go into it. If Bob signs his public key, we need the public key to verify the signature. Remember that signatures are generated using the private key, but the public key is what's used to actually verify the signature. But we're trying to verify the public key. So how can we verify the public key if we don't have a verified public key to verify the public key? It's sort of a circular problem. Alice can't trust the public key until she has some other public key that she trusts in order to verify the signature on Bob's public key. Otherwise, Mallory can just generate her own signature using her own private key, sign her public key, and now Mallory receives this public key and says, I have no way of verifying the signature. I can see that the key signed itself, but that doesn't really help me to trust that key. So clearly I got halfway through typing the sentence and then forgot to finish it. But the gist here, I was typing the sentence 5 minutes ago and then I got distracted. So whoops. But the key is you can't gain trust if you don't have anything to trust to begin with. And what we need here is called a trust anchor. A trust anchor is some party that we implicitly trust. So let's say Perrin and I, we don't trust each other's public key, but we both trust Nick Weaver, let's say. If Nick Weaver gives me a public key, if I know Nick Weaver's public key and he signs Perrin's public key, then if I trust Nick Weaver, then I trust Perrin. Nick Weaver becomes our trust anchor. Because we have a point of trust that we can begin to trust others because we implicitly trust that root anchor, that trust anchor. All right. As a side note, sometimes if we don't have anything to trust to begin with, we're going to rely on something called trust on first use. So what this says is the first time you communicate, just trust that public key. And then if that public key changes later on in the future, then throw up a message. This is used in SSH. So whenever you try to SSH into something new, you might get a message that's like, you're connecting to this server with an unverified host key. Do you want to continue? And that's it saying, I've never connected to the server before, but this key is new. So just letting you know, this is now going to be the trusted key. And then if you've ever like SSH'd into the Hive machine or the Project One VM, sometimes you'll see a message is like, oh, the host key changed, because the idea is if it changed, then the attacker is probably attacking you now. And the assumption that we're relying on is that attacks aren't frequent. So we're going to assume that attacks aren't happening the first time we communicate. It's not a very strong assumption, or it's a very strong assumption. It's not exactly something that we want to be relying upon if, say, we're interacting with a bank's website or other uses that are high important. So this is used in some situations, but outside of SSH, I don't see it around too much. Instead, what we're going to rely upon is something called a certificate. So a certificate is a signed endorsement. So an endorsement basically says, this is Perrin's public key. And that statement as a whole is signed by someone else's public key, signed by someone else's private key. This has to contain the two parts. It has to contain the identity of the person, and it has to contain the key. So if I just receive the key by itself and it's signed, that doesn't help me with anything. That just tells me this key was signed. No, instead, what I need is the entire statement of something is signed, or 0x ABCDE is Perrin's public key, and that entire message has to be signed. So we're going to use a abbreviated notation here, just because otherwise there's just too much to write out. We're going to say if we encrypt something using some public key PK, that's going to be the message, put it in brackets, and then we use this little subscript PK just to say it was encrypted. If we're signing, we're sort of doing the inverse, remember? So if we're signing with SK, that means this message here is, you have the subscript SK to the -1 because it's the inverse. This is just notation stuff. It's not super important, but it's stuff that you might see around sometimes if you work in, if you go read papers and whatnot. So just as a reminder, if we have a signed message, we also have to contain include the message along with the signature, because the signature itself doesn't include the original message. It's like a fixed length bit string, basically. All right, so let's say that Alice wants Bob's public key, but Alice doesn't trust Bob's public key, but Alice trusts Charlie. So we're going to say Charlie has a key pair PKC and SKC, and Alice only knows PKC. Charlie in this case is going to be our trust anchor. Charlie is the one we just say, we trust them just because, I don't know, they're a good person. They know how to manage their keys well. If we trust their key, then some certificate that we would trust is this statement. Bob's public key is PKB. This entire statement is signed by Charlie's private key, and we can verify it using Charlie's public key. And we are making the assumption that, or we know that because the signature was generated, Charlie really meant to say Bob's public key is PKB, and now we can trust PKB. So this is how we gain trust based on our implicit trust in others. Questions on how this works? All right. So now this is all great. We have this idea of a certificate. What we're going to do is now we're going to try to build an infrastructure for it. So I don't just want to know parents' public key. I want to know what anyone's public key is at like a moment's notice. So here's our first attempt. We're going to create something called a trusted directory. This is a central trusted directory. We'll just call it TD. And we can always ask the TD for someone's public key. So this TD has a public and private key pair, PKTD and SKTD. These names are getting really long to say in retrospect. The directory is able to publish PKTD and everyone knows it implicitly. So let's just say on my phone, if I want to communicate to the TD, this phone already has the public key for the TD pre-installed in it, and we don't need to like look it up anywhere, because how would we trust it if we looked it up somewhere? When we want to request Bob's public key, the directory is going to send a certificate for Bob's public key. So this certificate contains Bob's public key, and it also contains the statement that Bob's public key is this. This is what we would basically receive. Bob's public key is PKB, signed by the private key of the TD of the trusted directory. And if we trust the directory, which we do, then we can trust any public key that comes from the directory. So any certificate we receive signed by SKTD is now something that we can trust. What do we have to trust? We have to trust that we received the TD's key correctly. So I have to trust that somehow I have the right public key in my phone for the trusted directory. Otherwise, if Mallory instead put her public key in this phone, then she could man in the middle and give me a fake public key. Are there any other assumptions that we have to make? Is this enough to trust that every key we receive signed by SKTD is trustworthy, or is there anything else we need on top of this? And I'll say the theme here is going to be consider human factors. No takers? All right. We also have to trust that the trusted directory is not going to sign a key without verifying the identity of the owner. Is trusting TD different from trusting that we got their key correctly? Yeah, so we have to both trust. I guess it sort of goes hand in hand. Whatever public key we have, baked into our phones is the key that we're implicitly going to trust. So it's kind of the same thing. But the idea is I'm assuming that the key in my phone is the key of the trusted directory, and I'm going to trust it implicitly. So we have to trust the TD, and we have to trust that the key that we have actually belongs to the TD. That's sort of the full chain of trust there. But the other thing is we also have to trust that the TD is not going to sign a key without verifying the identity of the owner. So if the trusted directory is, let's say, not very trustworthy and just signs keys whenever it feels like it, it just finds a key somewhere on the internet and says, oh, we're going to say this belongs to David Wagner. If the trusted directory does that, then we can't, if we know it does that, then it's like, oh, well, how can I trust anything you're saying? Because you're basically just lying to me because you haven't verified the identity of this owner. So these are the assumptions that we need to make. All right. So let's say that for the context of this scenario, Michael Drake, who is the president of the University of California, runs the trusted directory. If we want Nick Weaver's public key, what we're going to do is we ask Michael Drake. If we want David Wagner's public key, what we'll do is we ask Michael Drake. And let's just say, oh, we need Raluca Adapopa's public key. We're going to ask Michael Drake. Can anyone think of some problems with this TD? What is the issue that you're starting to see here? Think, what if Michael Drake becomes evil or Michael Drake is offline? Those are both excellent points. We'll actually get to those in a moment, but sort of what I was looking for is Michael Drake has better things to do, like making sure his private key isn't stolen, and also, I guess, running the University of California. The overall problem here is the problem of scalability. There is no computer in the world that can possibly have enough computational power to serve the public keys for every single website in the entire world. And single point of failure, this starts to be brought up in chat. If Michael Drake is offline, then suddenly all of our infrastructure is broken. Cryptography just stops working because I have no way of figuring out what the public key of someone is, and I can't communicate with them. If the directory is compromised, so if Michael Drake becomes evil, for example, then you can't trust anyone. And you also run into the issue, if the directory is compromised, it's really difficult to recover from this issue because now, you know, the entirety of cryptography has just stopped working. How are you going to get an update to my phone that, oh, the new key that you should trust is this? Because suddenly it's like, we've stopped trusting the one thing that we could trust. And now we have no trust anchor and we can't trust anything anymore. So everyone in chat is correct. Scalability and the fact that this is a single point of failure is really, really bad idea. So instead of a trusted directory, instead of the TD, we're going to work with something called certificate authorities. To address scalability, we're going to work with hierarchical trust. So the roots of trust, and roots plural, there are multiple roots of trust, they're allowed to delegate their trust to someone else. So the certificate authority, let's just say MD is still the root of trust here. He can say, I trust Carol Christ, whose public key is PKCC, and I trust her to sign for, say, the entirety of UC Berkeley. So MD has not just verified Carol Christ's public key here, but he's also stated, I delegate trust for her to sign for other keys. Carol Christ might now go and say, okay, well, I have important UC Berkeley things to do. I'm going to sign John Canny's public key. John Canny's public key is PKJC, and I'm delegating my trust for him to sign the entirety of the CS department. And now John Canny is like, you know, I have important CS things to do. I also have this EE department over here that needs attention. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sign Nick Weaver's public key, and it's PKNW. But oh, I guess in this case, he's saying, but I'm not delegating my trust to him. So I'm not saying he can sign for any other people, but I'm still verifying Nick Weaver's identity. So in this case, MD is still the root of trust. And when we're dealing with certificate authorities, we call them the root certificate authority or just the root CA. Here, because Carol Christ and John Canny have received delegated trust to be able to sign for other people, they're going to be called intermediate certificate authorities. And we can trust Nick Weaver's identity, but we can't trust if he signs someone else's key that's a valid certificate. All right, that's the first idea of how we address scalability. Any questions on how this works? That's the first scalability, the first way we're going to address scalability. And the second way we're going to address it is by having multiple trust anchors. So whereas previously in the trusted directory model, we just had a single like mega computer that served everyone, we have multiple people that we all trust implicitly. So if I don't know how to do this on Linux. I was planning on doing this lecture on my Mac so that I could show you, but I don't know how to find it on Windows, so I won't do it right now. But there are about 150 or so, give or take, root certificate authorities that are implicitly trusted by most devices. Really, it's up to the manufacturer of the device to decide who exactly they trust. Generally, there's a little over 100 of these that everyone always trusts. These keys are hard-coded into operating systems and devices and so on and so forth, so that we have their public keys to start the root of trust. All right. So that gets into how we make this system scale. But we also have the issue of, maybe Michael Drake isn't evil, but maybe, he's having a bad day and he accidentally signed a certificate for someone else's public key and it actually wasn't them. It was someone else, someone from Stanford trying to impersonate Carol Christ. I don't know. We need to talk about how do we let certificate authorities revoke a certificate? What if they mess up? If we say Bob's public key is PKM, PK Mallory, and it's signed by the certificate authority, this becomes a problem. A more real-world example of this is VeriSign. So VeriSign is a very common certificate authority. I think they also happen to be in charge of the .com domain, which is okay, they basically own part of the internet. And they accidentally issued a certificate saying that some random user's public key belonged to Microsoft. Microsoft, if you haven't heard of them, is a fairly large company. So the fact that someone now has a key that looks like it belongs to Microsoft is an issue. So we have two ways of addressing faulty certificates. First one is each certificate is going to have some expiration date. So when the certificate expires, we are going to request a new certificate from the certificate authority. And the idea here is that, if VeriSign accidentally signs Mallory's key for Microsoft, there's only a limited amount of damage that they can do before that certificate expires and no one trusts that certificate anymore. Yes, a fairly large company. You might have heard of them from time to time. Some benefits of this are that, it mitigates damage. There's no certificate that will last forever. It's baked into the certificate scheme that most devices use. So at some point, no matter how badly you mess up, it's going to resolve itself at some point, although that point may be thousands of years into the future if you really wanted. Some drawbacks of this. There's this sort of annoying thing, which now means instead of just having the certificate authority sign my key once and then I never have to do it again, now I have to go back every 3 months or 6 months or a couple of years and ask them to sign it again. And it's just kind of annoying. And if someone forgets to renew a certificate, sometimes their website might stop working. So if you've ever come across a website that said, hey, your connection is insecure because it looks like the certificate expired a while ago, this is why. It's because some system administrator somewhere on Earth forgot to renew their certificate and then they broke their website for a bit. I've done this myself. I am guilty. We also have a trade-off of how often certificates should be renewed. If we require that they're renewed every 5 minutes, in theory, this is more secure because now any malicious certificate will only last for 5 minutes. But it also means that your system administrator has to go and ask for their certificate to be renewed every 5 minutes. So it's really annoying and it's not usable. And as we mentioned in lecture 1, if your security system is unusable, it will be unused. If we decide to go with infrequent renewal, let's say, oh, you don't need to renew like except once every 20 years. Well, now this is less secure because now Mallory's malicious certificate lasts for 20 years, but people are less annoyed. So there's no good solution. Let's Encrypt, which is a certificate authority that will sign certificates for free. They went with a really frequent renewal for every 3 months or so. And they have ways of sort of automating it, so it's not too annoying. But the key here is that there's some trade-off that you have to make when you're deciding on the validity period of your certificates. All right, questions on expiration dates or certificates in general? All right. So that's all right. But we still want some way of, oh, let's say we just signed a certificate and then we just realized, oh no, we signed the wrong public key. We still don't want that certificate being free to do whatever for 3 months. So what we're going to do is release a list of invalidated certificates every now and again. Question in chat, there's no need to change the CA public key, right? Those stay forever. So in reality, when we're dealing with delegated trust, we'll just go back to this for a moment. Each of these are certificates, and all of these are also going to have their own expiration dates. So technically, even root certificate authorities, those have some expiration dates because we don't want to trust them for forever. So all certificates, including the ones that delegates CA authority to others, have an expiration date. So the idea is even for those we're delegating trust to, we still want them to change their public key every now and again, or at least renew their certificate. And for the root certificate authorities, those expiration dates are usually set to like 2030 something, 2040 something. So they last for a really long time, and we're assuming that they hopefully won't be compromised. And we'll get into what happens if they're compromised. Who gives the new public keys for expired roots? Well, basically those have to take, because they're hard coded into the device, those are basically just like firmware updates and software and operating system updates for your computer. So sometimes when you receive an iPhone update or an Android update, that update part of it will be, oh, add a new root certificate authority or remove an old root certificate authority, because that's the only way that we can change the hard-coded certificates. So yeah, that's how they're distributed. It's a little clunky, but we have to have a root of trust somewhere. All right. Let's go back to, yes, so announcing invalidated certificates. These are going to be called certificate revocation lists because they're a list of revoked certificates. And so we have to ask the question of how do we authenticate the list? And the answer is that the CA is just going to sign this list. So this list will basically include something like the certificate whose serial number is, let's say, OX dead beef, is now revoked, and this statement is signed by the certificate authority. Can anyone think of any drawbacks with this? Is the system foolproof, or are there other issues that exist with this system? All right. If the CA gets compromised, it would be really bad. Yeah, I think, yeah, they could maybe generate a certificate revocation list and sign and basically revoke everyone's certificate. But I think in general, it would already be so bad because they can now sign a certificate for anyone. But yeah, I guess this would make the situation, even worse. The main thing is that the first thing is that lists can get really large. So this is mitigated by shorter expiration dates because once they expire, you don't have to list them in your CRL anymore. But for a really large certificate authority like Let's Encrypt, this might still get really annoying. It might become kilobytes or even megabytes, or I don't know how large they actually get, but say megabytes of just revoked certificate after revoked certificate, at least until they expire. You also are stuck with the problem of if the user hasn't downloaded the list yet, the user doesn't know which certificates are revoked. And so what happens if suddenly we can't contact the CA? What if the CA is offline? Well, now we have to make a choice. If we choose the fail-safe default, well, now we can't trust any certificate. And now we can't trust anybody. And now all of cryptography is broken. This doesn't seem like a very good solution, but the other one is also not great. If we just say, oh, use the old list, then now maybe there are some certificates that are potentially like supposed to have been revoked, but we just weren't able to receive that list yet. So if we assume that all those certificates are invalid, then the attacker could just force this CA to go offline and suddenly we can't trust anyone. Or even if we're saying, okay, just trust the certificates we trusted before, then if the attacker is just forcing the CA to be unavailable and the attacker has a malicious certificate, then they could also use that certificate maliciously because no one can basically get the message to Alice that like, hey, the certificate is revoked, you shouldn't trust it anymore. So there are no real good, well, there is one good solution, but it's not in scope for the semester. But I believe if you go back to spring 2020, there's a discussion on certificate transparency, which helps solve this issue at least a little bit. But yeah, what if revocation is ignored by the delegates? Delegates. What if, well, I guess the main people who care about, people who would care about the certificate revocation list would be the clients, right? Because they are the ones who need to verify if a certificate is to be trusted. So if the client ignores the certificate revocation list, then that might be signs of a bad implementation because we want to be verifying that these certificates can still be trusted. So I don't know if that answers your question, but maybe. All right. We have a very short blue slide here that basically says these protocols are really complicated. When we write it out as a message of, oh, Nick Weaver's public key is OX12345, that looks really simple. But in reality, the main protocol used is called X509. It's so incredibly complicated with like really weird encoding schemes, and there are a lot of like extensions. So you can also say it's like, oh, Nick Weaver is an HTTP server. So there's a lot of just weird complexities with this protocol that make it horrible to implement. And you can draw that back to like consider human factors if you really want, but basically certificates are really complicated. There's been this alternative model called the web of trust. So whereas before we're dealing with several roots of trust and then they sort of branch out like a tree, in the web of trust model, we're going to deal with structures that look more like graphs. So instead of having like a couple of roots that branch out, we're going to have just a bunch of points and they're all connected in arbitrary ways. So the way this works is that anyone can issue a certificate for literally anyone else. So if I like have Perrin's public key, I can just sign it myself and then publish the certificate to the world. For the Alice Bob example, if Alice signs Bob's key, Bob signs Carol's key, and if Dave trusts Alice and he trusts, well, if Dave trusts Alice, then the idea is, well, Alice signed Bob's key, so I don't trust Bob, but I trust Alice, so I trust Bob. And now Bob signs Carol's key, so now I trust Carol. So it's sort of this decentralized graph that will look complicated. I believe people have actually tried to draw it out before, but it's basically there is no central root of trust. The benefit is that you know the trust anchor personally, so you can choose who you trust rather than just having this baked in list in your phone that contains certificate authorities you've probably never heard of. But graphs are really complicated, and this just doesn't work very well in the real world, because in the real world, if I want to verify some random person on the internet, I probably don't have some chain of trust to them. OpenPGP, which is PGP stands for pretty good privacy, which I love because someone decided that this like protocol should just be called pretty good privacy. This originally used the web of trust model. There used to be these things called key signing parties where let's call them nerds, would go to meet in person. And instead of partying with, I don't know, alcohol or games or anything, they would meet in person for the purpose of signing each other's public keys. This quickly proved to be a disaster. And the reason you don't really see PGP used anywhere, almost anywhere, if you're curious about where it is used, ask me after lecture. But this model just isn't sustainable, and that's why we're relying on the roots of trust instead. Takeaway is that trust anchors just make public key infrastructures much simpler, because if you need to go and manually go and trust people yourself, your security system is too complicated to be usable. Okay, that is officially the end of new content, kind of. It's the end of new theoretical content. There's still a little bit of stuff that we want to talk about, but maybe actually, should we take a 5-minute break, do you think?
Sure, maybe like,
yeah. Why don't we take a 5 minutes?
5 minutes? Okay.
Okay, let's take a 4-minute break. We'll split the difference. We'll come back at 4:22. Well, it is 4:22, so we might as well head back into it as soon as I figure out how to get rid of this message on my screen. There we go. All right. So we've talked a lot about cryptographic primitives. We've talked about encryption. We've talked about MACs. We've talked about hashing. We've talked about, what else have we talked about? We've talked about public key encryption. We've talked about signatures. We talked about how we distribute public keys. We've talked about Diffie-Hellman. There's a lot of things that we've talked about. The rest of today is basically just going to be showing a bunch of real world applications and case studies of crypto. So as a reminder, if the slide is not blue, technically the content still is in scope, unless I say something in the middle of lecture that indicates that it's actually not in the scope. But I've looked through the rest of these slides and I believe everything that is white should be in scope officially. We're going to look at case studies. So for deniability, we're going to look at Facebook Messenger and how we report abuse, or actually those slides might have been taken out, I'm not sure. We'll look at the idea of snake oil cryptography. So a lot of marketing uses a lot of advertising that doesn't really genuinely represent the product, let's say. Unusable cryptography, which are technically secure, but absolutely horrible to use and thus are unused. And we'll look at nothing at my sig numbers. So how we trust that algorithms are not somehow backdoored. In terms of applications, we're going to talk about password hashing, which is really just how do we apply the principles of hashing to securely store passwords. And in fact, oh, there's one more. There's two more. So Bitcoin and Signal. Bitcoin, most of you have heard of Bitcoin. It's a money, quote unquote, system that doesn't rely on any central authority. And Signal, which is a secure messaging app. Both of these, or Bitcoin's going to be discussed more in depth on Monday, and Signal has been bumped all the way to the end of the semester. But those are well, Signal is my favorite topic ever to talk about. But yeah, we're actually going to start with password hashing. So I guess we're starting with the applications. So, excuse me, when we store passwords, and just for those of you who don't know, a password is some secret string that you're using to prove your identity. When we create an account, we create a password. And then when we want to log in later, what we do is we give that password to them again. And somehow they're going to be able to verify that it's like, oh, this is the password that you gave me the first time you created your account. Okay, well, how do we check that the password is correct? And the first idea that you might come up with on your own is, let's just store the user's password. Okay, the issue with this is, what happens if the attacker breaks into the service? The issue now is the attacker knows everyone's passwords because they're all just like listed in this file. That's not very secure. And now if this attacker goes and tries these passwords on other accounts, on other websites, then they could have a chance of breaking into your account. All right, so we shouldn't store the passwords in plain text. Well, maybe what we can try doing is encrypting the password. So it's better. It's not good, but it's better. If you're trying to verify a user's password, then what you have to do is you have to grab the password, go to the file, grab their encrypted password, decrypt the password, and compare the passwords. Well, if you have to decrypt the passwords, then you have to store the key on the server. So if the attacker breaks into your server, now they can just steal the password file and the key, and now we run into the same problem. The attacker can decrypt everyone's key. So both of these are bad ideas. Bad idea 2 is better than bad idea 1, but both of them are also just bad. We need some way of being able to verify passwords without storing information that allows them to recover the original password. And the name of this of this section of the slides sort of gives it away already, but we're going to use hash algorithms, password hashing. So what we do is for each user, we're going to store a hash of their password. So nowhere are we saving their original password itself. And what we do when we receive a password that they entered is we take their password, we hash it, and then we compare it to the hash in the database. If it matches the password in the passwords file, or if it matches the hash in the passwords file, then we know, okay, well, they must have given us the same password the first time because it hashed to the same value. So we know that they entered the same password as before, and then we log them in. Okay, what are some properties that we want in this hash? Well, we know it needs to be deterministic, because if we want to verify the password, we have to make sure that if they enter the same password, they get the same hash back. And we also want it to be one way, because if it's not one way, then we run into the same problem as before. If the attacker ever breaks into our server and steals the password file, then they can just reverse all of our passwords and get back the original values and use them on other websites. All right. Questions on, I guess, the 2 bad approaches here and the 1 good approach? I don't have chat open, I just realized, so I can't see anything. Oh, I accidentally started clapping. I hate it when that happens. All right. What are some attacks on password hashing? Well, the main thing that we have to deal with is, what if 2 users decide to use, say, password 123 as their password? Because hashes are deterministic, now they're going to have the same password hash in the database. An attacker, if they steal the passwords file, they're able to see, oh, these 2 passwords, or these 2 users have the same password hash, so they must have the same password. And thus they can infer, maybe this is some common password, so I can probably try to brute force it if I know what common passwords would be. This points to something called brute force attacks, which we've talked a little bit about before. But in these situations, what we're saying is most people use insecure and common passwords. And the attacker can really just compute all the hashes for common passwords and store them in a dictionary somewhere. So when we do that, that's called a dictionary attack. The attacker can just hash all the common passwords that exist. And if they ever get a passwords file, then they can just look up, okay, I have this hash in the passwords file, and oh, look, it corresponds to this hash in my database, and that was the hash for, I don't know, password 123, and now they can reverse that password. This is not good. This is not something we want. It's still better than encrypting the passwords because, if you use a good password, then the attacker probably won't be able to reverse it, but it's still not great. So there's also this construct called rainbow tables, which are really interesting, and you might have heard of them before. Very briefly, they're basically just an algorithm that lets you store dictionaries in a really efficient way. So it's like you still have to hash some, but it makes the dictionary brute force attacks a lot easier. Okay. Yes, time-space exchange. For those of you familiar with time-space trade-offs in general, this is a perfect example of that. All right, so we're going to solve the original problem by working with salted hashes. So what we're going to do is add a unique and random salt for each user. This salt is a random public value designed to make brute force attacks harder. So we don't need to keep this value a secret. It just needs to be something that introduces randomness into the hash. And you can almost think of it like an IV in that we're just going to store it in plain text in our passwords file. So for each user, we have in the file the username, the salt, and the hash of the password with the salt. When we want to verify a user, instead of just hashing the password as before, we're going to take their username and the password. We'll look up their username in the passwords file. And now, because we know their username, we know their salt. So now we can take the password that they sent us and the salt that we have for that user, hash that together. And if that hashes match, then we know that they entered the same password as before. For the salt, we want to make sure it's long and random because ideally this salt should be unique for each user. And as I mentioned before, these salts don't have to be a secret. They're basically just like nonces or IVs. This makes brute force attacks harder in an asymptotic way. So if you haven't dealt with asymptotics, it's totally fine. But if you have, then you will hopefully somewhat understand this next part. If we have m possible passwords in total and n users in the database, or let's just say we have m possible passwords and n users in the database. If the database doesn't have a salt, then what we can do is we can build a dictionary of all possible passwords or a rainbow table or whatever you want to do. And then because we can do constant time lookup, we can now go through and just scan for all the users' hashes. So that takes O of m time to build our table and O of n time in order to scan through our table and look for all users' passwords. So in total, that's O of n plus n. If we have a salted database, now we're forcing the attacker to deal with this really large random salt. So it's not feasible to brute force the space of all possible passwords and salts. So now instead what the attacker has to do is, okay, look at the first user, here's their salt, build the entire dictionary for that one salt and look up the user's password. Okay, now go to the next row, take that salt, build a dictionary for all passwords with that salt, look up their database, look up their password, and so on and so forth. So instead of O of m plus n, now it's O of m times n. So salting hashes makes the attack not only just like a constant factor longer, it makes it asymptotically longer. All right, that's the first solution for how to hash passwords well. Any questions on this? All right, the second thing we're going to use is, okay, we know that not many people are going to try 10,000 times when they enter their password. So we can just use a slower hash. Usually hash algorithms are designed to be fast. They're designed to take your 5 megabyte file and turn it into a fixed length string in a very short amount of time. So they're not designed to be slow and take up time to hash things. So when we're dealing with password hashes, we want them to be slow because the user is only trying once every 30 seconds or so. So we don't need that hash to run in 1 microsecond, we can have it run for like even 1/10 of a second, and they probably won't notice. Attackers, when they're attacking the hash, they don't know the original password, so they have to hash it hundreds of thousands, millions, hundreds of millions of times in order to actually find the correct hash. So if they use a slow hash, it can slow them down by a ton while being basically invisible to the user, because the user is not going to notice 0.00001 second versus 0.1 second. As a note, in this case, we're not changing the asymptotic difficulty. We're just basically adding a really large constant factor to make the attacker spend more resources. So the main slow hash algorithm that we're going to work with is PBKDF2. This stands for password-based key derivation function 2 because it's the second one. And it's just a slow hash function. It takes in 5 parameters or 3 parameters, the 3 settings and 2 inputs. So 5 parameters kind of. It's going to take in the underlying function that outputs some random looking blitz. So usually PBKDF uses HMAC SHA-512 or 256. It's also going to take in the length of the output. So you're allowed to generate a longer hash if you really want. It's going to take in the iteration count. So we'll get into this in a moment, but PBKDF, the hashing algorithm is basically, instead of hashing it once, hash it 10,000 times, and that just makes it slower for the attacker to compute. And then the inputs that actually produce the output are the password and a salt. So PBKDF takes in a salt as part of its function definition. And this string is just a long random n-bit string from the password and the salt. And yeah, the implementation is basically just computing the HMAC, which is also a valid hash. Remember, HMAC is a valid hashing algorithm, is basically computing the HMAC 10,000 times or however many times you want it to take. So it's a simple way of making hash algorithms slower, but it's effective in that now instead of, say, 1 million hashes, now the attacker has to perform 10 billion hashes, and that slows them down by a factor of 10,000. The benefits for this is that we can derive an arbitrarily long string from the user's password. So if we wanted, say, a 256-bit key, we could do that. If we wanted just like a 128-bit hash to store in the database, we could do that too. As I mentioned, this can be used as a symmetric key, or we could also use this to seed a PRNG or generate a public-private key pair. So these are basically random looking bits that can be used in other cryptographic implementations. This algorithm also intentionally, or not intentionally, but it is slow, but it doesn't use a lot of memory. So this is really good for devices that might not have a lot of memory, but have some amount of compute power and can compute this hash. So there are alternatives to this, like scrypt and Argon 2. Argon 2 is actually something you'll use in Project 2. But those algorithms are intentionally designed such that you need a lot of memory to actually be able to compute the result. That's just to force the attacker to consume even more resources than before. Questions on this? All right. When we're dealing with password hashing, normally we're going to do with 2 broad classes of attacks. We have the first class is offline attacks. So the attacker is able to perform all of the computation themselves. So if Mallory steals the password file from a server somewhere, then she can just go through and compute as many hashes as she wants. The defenses against offline attacks generally are you want to make sure you're using salted password hashes and slow hashes just to increase the amount of computation that they need to do. If they can do an offline attack, even with salted passwords and slow hashes, you're still going to want a really strong password just because, even if you're hashing the thing 10,000 times and you're salting it, if your password is 3 characters, it's still going to be trivial to break it no matter how many iterations of that you do. In an online attack, instead of having the password hashes directly, the attacker interacts with the service. So if Mallory is trying to log into some website and she's typing in a bunch of passwords, different passwords to try to log in, Mallory is forcing the server to compute the hashes to try to figure out what the password is and let her in. In this case, the attacker really only has a couple of tries per second at best, with no parallelism, because you're just really interacting with the server. And for this, what you want to do is to add a timeout to prevent the attacker from trying too many times. So if you see, oh, this user tried to log in 10 times in a row, then you just stop them from trying to log in, and now Mallory can only try 10 times before she's locked out forever. Let me double check if there are any more. All right, pause this for a moment. Try to figure out if there are any more white slides. I'm gonna jump over the iPhone slides for now because I don't think we have enough time for that. And then we can loop back around to it later if we really want. So that is password hashing. That's generally how you should hash and store passwords if you ever have to do that yourself. Now we're going to talk about something called snake oil cryptography. Snake oil in general, it originally comes from the 17 and 1800s, which just referred to cure-all medicines that basically, oh, try this literally snake oil, that it was supposed to cure headaches and diseases and basically anything that the marketers could think of. And this would take advantage of buyers who were uninformed and would take advantage of the lack of regulations. Nowadays, it's really just any kind of scam. If you use deceptive advertising to trick uninformed buyers into buying useless products, we're saying that you are selling snake oil. You are trying to scam people. Oh, I just see something. If hashes always output strings of the same length, how could you figure out how long the password is? The attacker doesn't know how long the password is. I guess passwords can be any arbitrary length. So because the password hash is fixed length, it doesn't actually leak any information about the length of the password, or at least it shouldn't. Why are longer passwords better then? Because the way to think of it is there are more 10-character passwords than there are 3-character passwords. So the longer, if the adversary somehow knows that, oh, your passwords are all 8 characters, then it's easy for them to brute force through all 8 possible 8-character passwords versus if you're using a 32-character password, which is impossible to brute force through all possible 32-character passwords. So it's sort of a combination of Shannon's maxim or Kirchhoff's principle, whichever one you want to call. And so generally, if you don't know the length of the password, what you'll do is you'll start by brute force through all the 1-character passwords, then all the 2-character passwords, and so on and so forth. So that's another reason, because they're generally going to start with the shorter length passwords. But basically, the longer your password is, the longer it's going to take to guess, just because there are more passwords of longer lengths. Okay. When we talk about security, in the security world, there's a lot of snake oil that people try to sell to other people. These are useless security products that are advertised to uninformed buyers. So hopefully by the end of this course, you'll have an idea of what on the market is snake oil and what is not. But some good signs are amazingly long key lengths. So once you're working with something like AES 128 or AES 256, where it's already so difficult that it would take the lifetime of the universe to break, making the key longer probably isn't going to help you. The NSA tends to be really paranoid about their data, which I think is understandable. And even they don't use keys that are larger than 256 bits, and they don't use public keys. Remember, public keys have to be longer, that are greater than 4096 bits. So it's a good sign that if the NSA has so much to lose and they're not using, larger than 256-bit or 4096-bit keys, you probably don't need really, really long keys. AES 3072 probably isn't going to help you. If you see new algorithms and just crazy protocols in general, that's probably a bad sign, because the point of cryptography is to use things that have been proven to be reliable before. There's no reason to use some brand new block cipher or hash algorithm or anything else, because the algorithms that we have are in use because they've been people have been trying to break into them for forever, and they haven't, so it's probably safe. New protocols also probably mean that someone somewhere sat down and tried to write their own cryptographic protocol. And this is bad. You should never write your own cryptographic protocol unless you have done so much research into this that you understand everything, like linear analysis and so on and so forth. Basically, if your name isn't David Wagner or Raluca, or if your name isn't, David Wagner or Raluca Adapopa, you probably shouldn't be writing your own cryptographic protocols, at least at Berkeley. If you see fancy technical buzzwords, that's probably also a good sign that you're being scammed. One term that tends to be thrown around pretty often is something called new math. I don't know what new math is referring to, because most of the math that we've used has been tried and tested already. So if they're saying new math, they're probably trying to scam you. If you see the words one-time pad, we talked about one-time pad a long time ago. One-time pads are secure if you never reuse the key, but if you never reuse the key, it's super impractical, because now the size of your key is now the size of your message. So if people are saying one-time pad, what they're almost definitely saying is stream ciphers. Remember that stream ciphers take some fixed length key, and then they generate a really long string of random looking bits using a PRNG. And then they XOR that with a plain text, and that's also secure. But you shouldn't call that a one-time pad, because that's not a one-time pad. Sometimes you'll see cracking contests. So someone will say, look at how secure our scheme is. If you can break our protocol, we'll give you $1 million or something. And it's like, wow, they're so confident that it's secure that they're willing to offer $1 million. But if you look at how these are actually set up, it's not a situation that you would actually want or see in the real world. Oftentimes it's just, here's a blob of bits, you should decrypt it. And they don't give you any context, they don't give you any structure. So there's no way that this would stand up in any real world setting. But, they're just doing that because they want to show consumers, it's like, oh, look how secure our protocol is. We're willing to put money on the line when it's not realistic whatsoever. Telegram, which I know is a fairly popular messaging app, at least with the people that I associate with, they offered a $300,000 prize to break their encryption. Their protocol is weird. I have some quotes here. My favorite is by a cryptographer named Matthew Green. Basically, it's like someone who had never seen cake, but heard it described, tried to bake one with thumbtacks and iron filings. It's not great, and their contest probably indicates that they are looking for other ways to bolster its perceived effectiveness, but yeah. And now is where we're going to pause again while I see if there are any other... Okay, there are more white slides. So unfortunately, we're going to skip over all of the fun snake oil, because we need to finally talk about nothing up my sleeve numbers before we head out. Otherwise, we'll not be able to cover all the content that we wanted today. So nothing up my sleeve numbers. The idea here is that cryptography uses a lot of constants. For something like SHA, there's some initial state that's just there to introduce some ones into the mix. For Diffie-Hellman, we had to have that prime number P and generator G, and those numbers have to be chosen somewhere. And for elliptic curve cryptography, you also need to deal with starting points on the curve just so that you have some numbers to work with. For the HMAC, we had the iPad and the OPAD, and those are also constants as part of the algorithm. And the idea is that even though any value could work, the designer had to choose some constant in there. For Diffie-Hellman, there's just a P and G that is used by everyone. And the question that we ask ourselves is, where do these default parameters come from? So we're going to tell a story of dual EC DRBG. So remember, PRNGs generate just a bunch of random looking bits from an input set of truly random bits called entropy. Dual EC DRBG was a standard published by the NSA behind the scenes. It relies on two parameters, P and G. So we're not going to go into the math too much, but these are basically points on the curve. So the elliptic curve is a curve, and there are points on that curve. And if there's some relationship between Q and P, then that will basically allow you to go back and break the internal state. In the regular discrete log, this would be analogous to if you could exponentiate P to some E and then get back to Q. So if you can recover Q. But the issue here is that these P and Q it was never described how they chose these values. They just published the standard one day and said, oh, these are the values you should use. And this might have been all right if the algorithm wasn't also kind of bad. It was a lot slower because it uses these elliptic curves. And even though that's faster than discrete log, it's still slower than HMAC or counter mode, where you are really just doing bit shifting and XORs and so on and so forth. And it wasn't a perfect PRNG. You could kind of detect that, oh, these don't look like truly random bits. You can actually see that it's like, oh, these look like outputs from dual EC DRBG. Cryptographers, they noticed this the moment the standard was published. And so you have to ask the question, why on earth would anyone publish this standard if this PRNG is just kind of awful? So, story time. The RSA, which is the same RSA as the RSA, but now it's a company, their data security accepts $10 million, we'll call it a donation from the NSA. In exchange, the RSA data security, they decide to implement the dual EC DRBG in their cryptographic library, and then they decide to make it the default PRNG. So there's money changing hands, and that probably means that something is amiss. With the support of RSA, they were able to make dual EC a NIST standard. So NIST is the standards organization of the United States. And this means that it was used in all the other products. All right, this is a suspicious situation. Now, 2013, Edward Snowden, a lot of people have heard of him. He reveals that the NSA has been spying on pretty much everyone. The New York Times talks about some crypto talk that was given by Microsoft people, and everyone realized that this is probably talking about this dual EC algorithm that just sort of came into existence without anyone asking for it. And it must be a backdoor. If you're not aware, a backdoor is basically just an attack that's inserted by some organization or malicious party that lets them attack the system, even though no one else can. So they have a way into the system that no one else has into the system. All right. So with this backdoor, they've discovered, oh, because of this P and Q value, the NSA can probably break into any PRNG and then predict both future and past outputs. HMAC or dual EC DRBG doesn't have this rollback resistance, unlike HMAC, which is another problem with the algorithm. So if there's no rollback resistance, if you use it to generate a secret key, then you generate some other random value that the attacker can see. then the attacker can go back and learn the internal state of the DRBG, and then they can go and view the secret key that you generated. So we'll skip over this Juniper network story because I want to get to the end of this. Oh, actually, I guess that is the end of it. I didn't have the conclusion slip that I wanted, but basically, it was never confirmed. No one was ever able to determine that there is this relationship between P and Q that would allow dually C DRBG to be sabotaged. But because no one has ever published, oh, this is how we chose these numbers, it is pretty much the assumed truth that there is this relationship and that the NSA is able to break this DRBG. So you should not use dually C DRBG because no one uses it. Everyone assumes that it has a backdoor. And because those constants weren't chosen in a way that allows, like, oh, they just use the digits of pi, you know, why? Obviously, this algorithm is not in use. It is broken. I believe that brings us to the end of all of our. Yeah. Good systems should clearly and transparently describe how public numbers are generated. You might argue about values that provide good security. So for example, in AES, some of the values are specifically chosen to provide more security. And if you can provide a reasonable proof for why that works, then that's a good reason to use those values. You might choose values with obvious human significance. So if we choose really significant numbers like pi and e and other like 1, then the developer probably doesn't have enough values to choose from that would allow them to create a backdoor. So maybe for a PRNG, you use your name or the first couple of digits of pi, or these obvious numbers that are 67452301, which is just 01234567 backwards. These are the constants that are actually used in SHA-1. For SHA-2, they use like the fractional parts of square and cube roots of prime numbers, which is a little bit odd, but if you think about it, there's not enough of those to create an obvious backdoor. So what we want to do is create numbers that can be, and you can easily verify that, oh, there's nothing, about these numbers that would allow the creators to have a backdoor. They're just there because the creator needed some numbers to put into his algorithm, into their algorithm, let's say. All right, I've skipped over a bunch of blue slides, but that finally brings us to the end of this lecture. And if people are curious enough, I can. All right, I guess first, any questions on this, and then I'll stop the recording and I can go back and talk about some of the blue slides. All right. Well, in that case, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and then you can feel free to ask questions.